Hey guys, it's Bench175, and in my last video I showed how I used this Walmart Hyper-Tough Dremel tool, some polish, and a Ghost Complete spring kit to reduce the trigger pull in my Shadow Systems MR920 down from 4 pounds at the tip of the trigger to about 3 1/4 pounds. And I also did an install of the bullet middle slide release from Ghost. And this time I'm going to show how to do an install of the Ghost Pro 3.3 connector. The Ghost Pro 3.3 connector has a tab on it that you trim down specific for your Glock. So you're trimming it little by little, this tab right here, so that you can reduce the overtravel. And for those of you that don't know, overtravel is when you pull the trigger and after it breaks it still travels to the rear a little bit. And when you can reduce that over travel, you can potentially get faster follow-up shots. And so the video will show the disassembly of the frame in order to do it, and a little bit of me trimming down the connector and showing you where it ends up in order to work for the MR920. Beside the Dremel tool or some type of file, you'll also want a Glock Disassembly tool, which is basically a flat-ended 30 seconds punch. And I'd also recommend a roll of tape to help you push out the pins, and a utility knife for scoring the connector where you need to cut it down to. And ideally you'll have a Glock Armor's backplate, but if not, I'll show how you can make one using some old packaging like this. And the point is to have a small gap at the bottom of your backplate so you can stick a tool in there and manipulate the trigger bar. Right away the instructions say to remove 1/32 of an inch from the tab, so I'm gonna go ahead and score it, put down this, score it. So yeah, there's a little score line, you might not be able to see it, but it's on there. And then put on some safety glasses, plug in your Dremel. We're just going to start running this across the tab. So this cutting disc does come with this Hyper-Tough Dremel tool from Walmart. I'm running the Dremel tool on the slowest speed. So I'm going to keep working on this until I get it down to the right, to the score mark. Okay, so let's disassemble the frame. I start with the top locking block pin, and then I do the trigger pin, and then the trigger housing pin. So locking block pin is easy. That one just pushes out. And then for the trigger pin, you want to wiggle your slide release a little bit while you lightly push down on the pin itself. Now the trigger housing pin. And all three of these pins are very different, so it'll be easy to figure out which one goes where when we reassemble. Here's the slide release comes out. The locking block just pulls upward, or if it doesn't pull upward, you can use the punch or the disassembly tool to kind of pry it up. So this comes out, and then you just pull up on the ejector a little bit, and you'll see it just easily pops out. To get the connector out, you're going to flip the trigger assembly around, and then you'll see the bottom end of the connector right here shining through, and you're going to use your disassembly tool and push in that hole, in that area. So there you go, the connector comes out. And let's go ahead and compare it to the Ghost connector. Let's compare the Ghost connector on my left to the stock MR920 connector on my right. So this one is actually a TTI Ultimate from Terran Tactical Innovations. And one major difference you can see is the Overtravel tab on the Ghost connector. And how that actually works is when you're pulling the trigger backward, you can see that the trigger will break about here ideally, and then the Overtravel tab will stop the trigger from moving any more backward, where obviously there's nothing to prevent the to prevent the trigger and trigger bar from over traveling with the stock. Another difference is supposed to be the angle of this little lip that's on the connector, but I'm not seeing any major difference between the two. So let's see if I can line them up on camera. Because a less steep angle is supposed to mean less resistance for the trigger bar. So you can imagine if the more horizontal that this angle is, the easier it's going to be for the eagle's head to travel down it. Whereas if it's more vertical and the eagle's head is pushing against a wall, then there's going to be a lot more resistance. Let's reassemble with this. And this is going to be the process of trimming it a little bit and then reassembling. Before you put the arm and the crucifix in that slot, you want to put the new connector about like 80% of the way. Whoa, this one's kind of loose. So put it in about 80%. Put the arm of the crucifix in that slot, and then push the connector all the way into the housing. So there you can see the connector now, slightly angled like how it's supposed to be. The eagle's head is outside of the connector. Let's get the frame. So I put the trigger end into the frame first, and then put the eagle's head underneath the connector tab, and then push it in. The frame is, the back end opposite of the ejector is touching the frame. Actually, it helps if you can put in the pin a bit easier if you push them together. So push the housing and the frame together, and then you can probably push this in by hand like that. Let's put in the locking block. So at this point you don't have to put in the slide release again. We're just putting everything else in except the slide release. Put the housing, push it against the table like that. Put the trigger pin in. Okay. The process is now to reassemble and check if your gun will dry fire, because it won't if this tab is too long, but that's why you have to reassemble and check as you're trimming it down to the point where the trigger will break, but it will also not over travel. Ideally for this part, you have an armor's back plate, which kind of is cut off halfway. But if you don't, there's a trick you can do to kind of simulate it. So let's go ahead and disassemble this. Oh, forgot to do this part. Remove the barrel. And we're going to remove the back plate so I can trace it out and replace it with a clear back plate. So you're going to push the lug of the trigger of the firing pin back a little bit until you can have a space between the lug and the spacer sleeve in there. You're going to put your tool in there and then push downward on the spacer sleeve. And while you do that, you're going to push the back plate out. Now go ahead and release. Pull out the disassembly tool. There's a back plate at. Take the back plate now and get some hard piece of plastic. Put it on there and trace it out, and then cut it in half. So I'll show you the end product right now. As you can see, I cut out a clear black back plate. So now let me show you what that does. So you push down on the back of the firing pin so that you can slide this back plate in there. So that is taking care of the firing pin. So the clear back plate lets you see how close the lug of the firing pin is to clearing the back end of the crucifix with the help of a flashlight. Reassemble. So the back plate has to be short enough so that you can clear the ejector, just like the normal back plate. So we reset the trigger. So hopefully you can see the lug of the firing pin is on the back end of the crucifix right there. And if the Overtravel tab of the connector is short enough, then the trigger bar will be, the back end of the crucifix will be able to drop underneath the lug of the firing pin. So hopefully I can catch that on camera happening in my case. So right now I'm pulling the trigger harder and harder. You can see it move down. And there, that was like the perfect amount where it just barely dropped enough for the lug of the firing pin to move forward. Let's actually test this again as I hold down the slide. So right now what I'm doing is I'm holding the slide down into the frame because I don't want a downward force on my slide to be able to inhibit the function of my trigger, right? So I'm pushing down on my slide and I'm trying to pull the trigger again. Okay, so as you can see this time, if I'm with that downward pressure on my slide, it's actually pushing the lug of the firing pin down enough that it's not able to clear the crucifix of the trigger bar. But if I pull it up a little bit, now I can clear it. So you want to make sure that with downward pressure on the slide that you're still getting your trigger to work. So I'm going to trim it a tiny bit more and then polish it down, show you the final product. I forgot to say that I actually cut the connector tab as short as I thought it should be around, just from past experience. And so that's why I'm getting it to work right away. But you might have to cut it down the direction, say, 1/100th of an inch at a time, which their hint says is as thick as this paper. So you're going to keep cutting it down until you can actually dry fire your gun. If at this point you can't dry fire your pistol, then while you're holding the trigger to the back, you'll need to stick the tool just to the right of the firing pin lug and on top of the trigger bar cruciform and push down on the cruciform, and that'll get your trigger to break so that you can disassemble. If that still doesn't work because your Overtravel tab is way too long, then you'll just need to remove the back plate so that you can completely remove the firing pin assembly and get the slide to move forward and off your frame. Okay, so I just finished trimming the Overtravel tab a little bit more, and now I just changed over to a stone on the Dremel, and I'm just going to lightly touch it just to remove any burrs from this face of the connector, and then do the final reassembly because I think I should be good after this. Yeah, it feels good and smooth on this face. Let's do a final measurement. So for the MR920, a bit under 1/8 of an inch. So I think the probably millimeters is probably easier to see. It's just a tiny bit under 3 millimeters. Let's go ahead and do the final reassembly. If your trigger bar happened to fall off of the spring, you're just going to hold up the spring like this, and then slide the trigger bar, tilt it down, and then slide it until it goes inside the hole on that back piece of the trigger bar. Now I'm going to put in the connector. So I like to put it about 80% of the way to give me a little bit of room to put that far side of the cruciform into the drop safety slot. Now you push the connector all the way down until the base of it is below flush from the housing. I'm going to put a drop of oil where the connector and the eagle's head of the trigger bar rub against each other. So a little drop of oil right there. Now go ahead and seat the eagle's head of the trigger bar. Get your frame, put the trigger in, and then slide in the housing. Should all go in smoothly. First I put in the housing back pin. So in the MR920 it's a polymer pin. Put in the locking block until it seats all the way down into the frame. So the top pin, the locking block pin, goes first because your slide release is going to fit in between the frame and the trigger, and the spring is going to slide underneath the locking block pin. You line up the hole of the slide release with the hole in the frame, and then you put that pin in. Might take a little bit of wiggling around. Okay, everything looks good on the frame. And now we're going to remove that plastic back plate and put in the real back plate. And again, you're going to push the firing pin backward if it's not backward all the way, so that you have enough space for your disassembly tool. Push down, slide the back plate out. Now we have the real back plate in. Okay, test function. And actually remember, test function with downward pressure on the slide. So this is in the case that someone grabs your gun like this, or someone's pushing down pressure on your slide, you still want it to work. So I'm going to push downward pressure here and make sure that the trigger still works. Okay, looks like it's working. And let's go ahead and measure the trigger pull. So that was right at 3 pounds. So let's get a good grip and see how the trigger feels. Very smooth and light. Show you the reset. And then the Overtravel. Alright, time to take this to the range before I can depend on it for self-defense. Hopefully that all helped. If you guys have any questions, you can leave them in the comments. Please like, subscribe, and share, and I'll talk to you guys next time.